Hello and welcome to today's Saratech Enablement series. My name is Sarah Utsugi and I'm the marketing coordinator at Saratech and I'll be your host today. Presenting today, we have Allison Redderson-Lear, who's a mechanical engineer at Saratech, and she'll be talking to you about using FEMAP API to query results visualization. All right. Hi, Allison. Thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hey, Sarah. I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Saratech?
Yep, so I'm a mechanical engineer here at Saratech. I've been here for about 6 years now. I do finite element analysis as well as programming and a little bit of design work.
Great. Well, we're excited to hear what you have to share with us today. Why don't you go ahead and share your agenda and take it away?
Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about what we talked about in the previous session. In that one, we use the FEMAP API to grab an image of the graphics window and save it, as well as set the contour settings for that image. If you missed that one, you can find it on our YouTube channel, like Sarah mentioned. In this session, we'll be talking about using FEMAP API to query results values. And in the next session, which I'll give a date for later, we'll be bringing that all together to use the FEMAP API to write out to a Microsoft Word document. So today, we'll be talking a bit more about output in FEMAP 2020.1 and above. And that's going to include the results browsing object and how to use that object to read and write output data. So I mentioned this in the previous session, but it warrants mentioning again. Output vector IDs have changed in FEMAP 2020.1 and above. So if you do have those legacy APIs, you will need to update them to use the new ID ranges. And we'll also be talking in this session about how to get those ID ranges. If you've used FEMAP API before, you might know that in FEMAP 2019 and earlier, you would use the output set and output objects to work with output sets and output vectors, respectively. And you also had the option to use the results browsing object. But at the time, the results browsing object was only for reading output. In FEMAP 2020.1 and above, now we want to use the results browsing object wherever possible. And it can read and write output now. The output object, which was used for output vectors, has been obsoleted. And the output set object is still used to create and manipulate output sets. So let me go over to FEMAP here. So here I have my example model. I have some output over here. I will open our programming window, zoom in a little bit just so you can read that a bit better. And we'll get started. So first off, I need a results browsing object to read and write results. You can think of the results browsing object sort of similar to the data table. It's sort of a spreadsheet layout. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail once we start actually using the object. So this is going to be FEMAP.results. And also note that the results browsing object can only hold either elemental or nodal results. It can't do both at the same time. So in this case, I've named my variable eres as an elemental results, just so I can keep track of that a bit better. I'm also going to need an ID query object to get my output vector IDs. And I'll need a set for the elements that I'm interested in. Now I'm also going to make a set for the output sets that I'm interested in. In this case, I'm probably just going to grab all of them, but maybe you want your users to select it or something like that. So I'm just going to make a set here. Okay, now what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be pulling out results from our model and using those results to calculate some sort of margin of safety based on an allowable. So I do want a variable to hold that allowable. And I'll need more variables for the output set and output vector IDs. because I want to create an output set that has my margin numbers so that I can easily contour those and display them in the graphics window. So like I mentioned, the results browser object is kind of similar to the data table. It's organized in rows and columns. Each row represents one entity, and each column represents one output vector. So I'm going to need a variable to hold the number of columns that I've added to my results browser. And I'm going to need another one for the indices of those columns. And we'll get to how we use those in a little bit. I'm also going to create an envelope, and I'm going to base my margin of safety calculation on the maximum stress out of all the results that I select. So I'm going to similarly need some variables to hold information about the about where those results are in my results browser object. So I'll need one for the value itself and one for its source. And GoToWebinar is letting me know that I might be having some connection issues. So Sarah, just let me know if I need to repeat anything. Viewers,
everything's looking okay.
Okay, great. And I think viewers can write in the chat if I start cutting out here. So we'll also need some variables for the entity IDs and the corresponding results. Finally, I'll make an array for our margin of safety values and a return code. Since this is just a quick demo, I probably won't make too much use of the return code, but I do like to include it just so that people can see how it can be used. Just in case anything goes wrong, the first thing you always want to do is check to see what your return code is. Often that'll give you some hints about what the issue might be. So for simplicity, I'm just going to set our allowable to a flat value. In reality, maybe I would use an API to calculate this. Maybe I'm pulling it from an Excel spreadsheet. There's a lot of possibilities here, but for this case, I'm just going to set it to a flat value. So first, I'm going to ask the user to select some elements. So I'll say eset.select. I want the user to select elements. I do want to clear out the set of any previous selections. And for a title, I'll just say select elements to calculate combined results. Okay, so now I need to add output sets to our O set. Like I said, I'm just going to add them all. Again, maybe you have an API to determine which ones to add. Maybe you're reading from a spreadsheet. There are a lot of possibilities here, but again, just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to go for all of them. Now we need to get the output vector ID that we're interested in, so we can make use of our ID query object. So I'm going to say outvec ID equals ID query. And most of the elements I have in here are plates. I do have some other types, but for this case, I'm interested in plate elements. And I'm interested in stress. I can just go ahead and select that from the autocomplete there. And let's say I'm interested in maximum principal stress. I'll go with top max principal stress at the centroid of our element rather than one of the corners. Okay, now that I have my output vector ID, I can start working with our results browser object. So the first thing I want to do is tell the results browser what data I'm interested in. So I'm going to set data needed. I'm interested in elements. And I'm only interested in the elements that are in the set that the user selected. So just a quick note about the data needed. If you're working with nodes instead of elements, you'd specify the node type as your first argument. And if you are using a conversion column to convert between elemental and nodal results, then you will want to specify both elements and nodes that you're interested in. Otherwise, the object will just grab everything in the model, which can take a long time for large models. So now that we've done that, we can add a column to our results browser for each of the output sets that we have. So I'll say oset.reset, so we start back at the beginning. And while oset.next. So I'll make use of my return code just in case. And I'll say eres.add column v2. You will see a lot of v2s in here with these new methods. They're meant to work with the changes to the output vector ID ranges. So we use add column v2. And first I need our output set. So that's going to be my oset.current ID. That's the current output set ID that I have in there. Now I'm going to need my output vector ID. So I'll use that output vec ID that I calculated earlier. Next, we need to determine if we want to also add the component corner results. For this case, no, I'm not too concerned about corner results for this. And finally, I get my two outputs. The first one is going to be the number of columns. The second one is going to be an array of indices of those columns. So if I had decided to add corner results, then I would end up with several columns. But since I didn't, I'm only going to end up with one column. So I'm going to say ncalls for that first one because it's the number of columns, and icalls for the second one because they're going to be the indices of the columns. And now this is particularly important when you're using a loop to populate your results browser like this. I'm going to say set icalls equals nothing. So for this case, I'm not going to use icalls later on in the program, so I don't need to know what those indices are. But each time the API goes through this add column v2 method, that icalls variable needs to be empty so that it can be populated. If I did not have this line, then I would probably get an error when I tried to add another column. So because I'm doing this in a loop, I do need to do that. The next thing I'm going to do is add an envelope column. So I'll go eres.add envelope column. And I want to take the maximum. I also have the option to take the maximum absolute value or the minimum values. For this case, I'm going to go maximum. And just like the add column v2, I need to specify some arguments for the outputs here. So the first one is going to be the data column index. So I'm going to say env data. And the next one is going to be the basically the source of the value that gets populated in our envelope. So this is going to be the column ID or the column index that has this maximum value that's going to get put into this column. So I'm going to use env source for that. And now that I have all of my columns in here, I can say rc equals eres.populate. So once my API gets to this line, it's going to look at all the columns that I've added and the data needed to determine how many rows it's going to need. And it's going to put all of my output data into those rows and columns. So now I can say rc equals eres.get column. And note that if you're working with a large model or something with a lot of results, you're always going to see a performance improvement if you use the get column method over something like get entity value. So get entity value just gets a specific value for a specific entity, which is great if you only need one value. but for this case, because we need values across the entire model, it's going to be way faster to just get all of them all at the same time using get column. So the column index that I'm interested in is going to be that envelope data column. So I'm going to say IENV data. The next two are outputs. So it's going to give us an array of entity IDs and an array of corresponding results for those entities. So I'm going to use entity IDs and entity results in there. So now that I have an array of results, I want to redimension my margin of safety array to be the same size as those. So I'm going to use the upper bound of the entity IDs array to set the dimension on my margin of safety values. Now I can say, I can use a for loop here. I'll start with 0 and go to the upper bound of entity IDs. And for each of those, I just want to set a value for my margin of safety. So this is just going to be the allowable divided by the entity results minus 1. And we can validate that to some extent by just printing something out to the message window. I'm going to use the error color, even though this is not an error. It's nice and bright, easy to see. And I can put in my entity ID. I'll just use the first one. And I'll separate those with a colon and a space. I'll put in my results value so that I know if my calculated margin is reasonable or not. Another colon and a space. And finally, the margin that we calculated. And that's all my parentheses. So I'll go up here and click play. And it looks like I made a typo in here. Yep, I forgot the equals sign. Okay, so I'm just going to select all elements. This is a pretty small model, so I don't expect it to take a long time. And it looks like I made another typo in there. This is going to be from I0 to entity IDs. I want to say I should have a -1 in there, but because we're a little bit short on time here, I'm going to copy over the program that I wrote in advance just to save some time here. So I'll select all, click OK, and it'll spit out the ID of the element that's first in that array, the stress value from the envelope, and finally the margin value that we calculated. So if we do want to spit these margins out into an output set in FEMAP, then we just need to add a couple of variables here. I'll scroll back up just so that all the variables are kind of in the same place here. First, we'll need some more variables to manage our output vector ID. So it's going to be outvec ID as long. And we'll need one for the column that we're going to add. That's going to be our column index. And because we're creating a new output set, we will need an output set object. There we go. So after the user selects elements, I'm going to go ahead and create that output set. So we can set some properties here. It's going to be outset.id. And we'll just use the next empty ID for that. We can set our title. I'll call this margin of safety. And we can set some other properties here. These aren't strictly necessary, but they might make it easier for users to interact with the output set in a way that they're accustomed to. So we'll use outset.analysis is static. And that should be an equal sign. There we go. So now that we've set all these properties, we can save our output set into the database using the put method. So that's going to be outset.id. Okay, so there's our new output set created. I'm just going to click play to make sure that goes through. And yeah, it's creating our output set. Now we need to start putting actual data in there. So similar to before, where we asked for an output vector that corresponded to our plate top max principal stress, we're also going to ask for a user ID. So instead of specifying plate, I'm going to specify user. I'm just going to grab the first ID available. Everything else is pretty much the same, except after we add our envelope column, we do need to add an empty column. Once you call populate, you cannot add any more columns to your object. So we do want to get all of our columns in there, even if they're going to be empty. So I'm going to say rc equals eres.add, and I want to add a scalar value or elements. So I'm going to use this initialization method. There are several different methods for adding empty columns, but this one is convenient. So I'm going to use outset.id because that's the ID of the output set I created earlier. The output vector ID that we created earlier. The title, again, I'm just going to go with margin of safety. The category, I'll put any. Is this nonlinear? No, it's not nonlinear. It can be linearly combined with other things. And finally, it's going to give us back the column that we just created. So I'm going to use my mscol variable to hold on to that. So once we populate the object, this is just going to be an empty column that's waiting for us to give it some values. So down here, after we've printed stuff out to the message window, I'm going to say rc equals eres.set scalar at column. So previously I used the add scalar at column to add an empty column. Now I'm going to use set to set values in there. I'm going to give it the column index for our margin of safety column. The number of entities that I'm setting here, that's just going to be the upper bound of the entity IDs array plus 1. The entity IDs array, that's going to be all of the IDs that we're interested in populating in this column, and the values of our margin of safety. So now that I've put stuff in my empty column, I do need to save it into the database. So I'm going to say rc equals eres.save column. And you have the option to also just use the save method instead, which will save everything in your results browser object. Since I did create this envelope column, I don't really want to save that, so I'm just going to save the one column that we just made, which is this one. So I'm going to go ahead and click play, select all of my elements, and you can see we have a new output set here. You can go ahead and contour that. Select my margin of safety, and you can see for the most part, everything is pretty good. It does look like we dip down into the negatives here. So maybe we need to go back to our design team and talk to them. Because we have this plot, it's very easy to see, which elements are doing well versus which elements maybe not so much. So I will go back to the PowerPoint here. So notable takeaways from this, you can use the FEMAP API to rapidly query model output. This does work for very large models. Once you get up to millions of elements, you will see some performance hits, but this is definitely faster than in FEMAP 2019 and below. And do remember that you will need to update any legacy programs you have to use the results browsing and results vector ID query objects. You will get some error messages, some warning messages if you continue to use those old methods. So if you do need help with API, you can check out the FEMAP custom tools. I did talk about this in the previous session, so you can go back and check out that video if you're interested. But the custom tools are just FEMAP APIs that come shipped with FEMAP. The code is available to you in the FEMAP installation directory, as well as some documentation about what each one does. If you do need additional help, you can always contact us. We do have FEMAP API training available, as well as mentoring available to our customers. And you can follow us on YouTube for sessions like this and other content. So are there any questions?
All right. Looks like we have a few questions, but as a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the questions panel. The first one is, do the entity IDs in the results browser count as a column?
So that's a great question. No, they don't. The first column in your results browser object is always going to have output in it. The entity IDs are kind of their own thing. They do not count as a column.
Okay, the next question is, what's the difference between the results browser envelope column and an envelope created with model output process?
So that's a great question. So if you go up to model output process, you do have a lot of options here for manipulating output, such as linear combinations or creating envelopes yourself. And the values are exactly the same. The difference is that this envelope column is temporary. So I can use the data in this column to calculate other values like we did here without actually having to go through and create an output set in my model with those envelope values that maybe is not as useful as the margin data itself.
Great. Looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. So Allison will be presenting part 3 of this series. You can catch that on August 5th. It'll be using FEMAP API to write data to Microsoft Word. So if you have anyone who may be interested in either of these upcoming sessions, make sure to have them register on our website. They only have to register one time, and they can have the full year of CES training. So if you're ready to take it to the next level, Saratech offers much more than software. We have a wide variety of options for training, services, and 3D printers. So if you have any questions about that, you can email us at marketing@saratech.com. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Allison, and have a great day.
Thanks for checking out our channel. If you like what you saw, make sure to like and subscribe down below so you don't miss out on any new videos. Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter for the latest engineering news and information. And to see all of our upcoming events, please visit our website at saratech.com/events.